The day began with rising tension in the tall company tower where Mark the CEO worked every morning. Usually, he entered the building with a confident walk and a calm greeting for his staff, but today his steps were heavy and his face looked tired as if he had not slept at all. The security guard at the front desk noticed that Mark did not even pause to say good morning, and this alone was enough to make people whisper in the lobby because Mark never ignored anyone unless something serious was happening inside the company. The elevator ride to the top floor felt longer than usual for him, and he stood with his hands pressed together trying to gather the strength he needed for the day ahead. When the doors opened, he stepped out quickly and headed straight for the main boardroom without speaking to any of the workers who were already preparing reports and files for him. Inside the boardroom, large screens covered the walls showing numbers and graphs that were all moving in the wrong direction. Papers were scattered across the main table as if a storm had blown through the room. A major business deal had collapsed overnight, and important investors were demanding answers. Mark had always tried to remain calm under pressure, but this problem was different because it had arrived with no warning and carried the power to damage the company from top to bottom. As he stood in the center of the room, he felt the weight of every responsibility pressing harder on his chest. He knew he had only 1 hour to find a solution before the board meeting began, and the fear of failure made his thoughts spin in confusion. Mark stepped out into the hallway because he needed fresh air, even if only for a moment. As he walked out, he heard the slow rolling of a cleaning cart at the far end of the hall. The sound was familiar because it belonged to Tom the janitor who worked the evening shift but sometimes arrived early when he wanted to finish tasks quietly without disturbing anyone. Tom was an older man with kind eyes and a gentle presence. Most people in the building did not pay much attention to him because he moved quietly from room to room and never tried to draw attention to himself. Still, everyone respected him because he always carried himself with calm discipline and treated the building as if it were his own home. Tom looked up when he saw Mark and gave him a small respectful nod. Mark tried to smile back, but the stress in his mind made it difficult. Tom paused his cleaning work and asked if everything was all right in his calm, soft voice. For a moment Mark thought about walking away because he did not want anyone to see him struggling, but the weight inside him felt too heavy and he found himself speaking without thinking. He told Tom about the collapsed deal, about the investors who were waiting, about the pressure that kept building, and the fear that he would let everyone down. The words came out in a rush because he had held them in for too long. Tom listened patiently without interrupting. He did not act surprised or confused. He simply stood there taking in each detail with steady eyes that did not judge or question. When Mark finished speaking, Tom moved his cart aside and asked if he could look at the documents that were causing so much trouble. Mark hesitated because the idea of letting a janitor inside the boardroom felt strange, but Tom's calm presence made him feel slightly stronger. He opened the door and allowed Tom to walk inside. The boardroom felt tense, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to happen. Tom stepped forward slowly and placed his hands on the table. He did not rush. He began to gather the scattered papers and sort them into neat stacks. His hands moved with quiet purpose, and each movement seemed to bring a small amount of peace into the room. Mark stood by the door watching him because he could not understand how someone who came from such a simple role could bring such calmness into a place filled with pressure and fear. Tom asked a few simple questions about the deal and the investors. His questions were not complicated, but they made Mark think in a clearer way. Bit by bit Tom brought order to the table. At one point he asked Mark to hand him a file from the far side of the table. Mark picked it up and handed it over. Tom opened it slowly and began to study the pages with full attention. Then he placed the file beside another stack that seemed unrelated. Mark watched with confusion but said nothing. As Tom read, he moved his finger along the lines of the contract and paused at a particular section. He asked Mark if he had read the secondary clause that allowed renegotiation during market shifts. Mark felt a sudden jolt of shock because he had completely forgotten about that clause. In the rush of panic, no one on his team had reviewed it either. Tom then suggested that he read it again carefully. Mark took the file with shaking hands and read through the clause. His heart began to beat faster, but this time with relief, because the clause gave the company a path to safety. It offered enough room to adjust the deal and prevent major losses while giving time to rebuild trust with the investors. Mark looked at Tom with amazement. He wondered how he himself had missed such an important detail when it was clearly written on the page. Tom met his gaze with a gentle smile, and told him that sometimes people became so overwhelmed by worry that they lost sight of the simple answers right in front of them. Mark felt a wave of gratitude wash over him because Tom had given him hope when everything felt dark. For a moment, the boardroom no longer felt like a battlefield, but a place where clarity could return. Tom picked up another stack of papers and continued organizing the table. His hands moved carefully, and each action seemed to bring more calm into the room. The silence around them grew stronger, not the uncomfortable kind, but a peaceful stillness that made everything easier to understand. Mark watched him with deep respect because he realized that wisdom could come from places where people least expected it. Mark stepped closer and thanked Tom with sincere emotion. Tom nodded and reminded him to breathe slowly because clear thinking always begins with steady breath. Mark stood still and inhaled deeply, feeling his confidence return piece by piece. He looked at Tom not as a janitor, but as someone who carried quiet knowledge. The moment felt important because it changed something inside Mark. Then, with urgency still present in his voice, Mark said, "Please make it fast." Tom placed his hands gently on the table again, and as they moved, the entire room fell silent, as if even the walls were listening. As Tom continued to move his hands across the table, something in the air shifted again. The numbers on the screen still showed trouble, but the room felt less frightening now because Tom's calm presence made every moment easier to handle. Mark stood beside him, watching closely as Tom organized the documents into clear groups. For the first time since the crisis began, Mark felt a small spark of hope inside his chest. Tom paused and looked up at him with a steady expression, then asked if Mark trusted his ability to guide the next step. Mark nodded without thinking because he had already seen how Tom understood the situation better than anyone expected. Tom picked up a folder with financial projections and placed it near another one that held investor feedback. He asked Mark to read a few lines aloud, and as Mark did so, Tom began to explain how each point connected. His voice remained gentle but confident, and by the time he reached the last page, Mark could see patterns that had been invisible before. It felt strange to learn so much from a man whose job was cleaning the building, but Mark understood that experience came in many shapes. Tom had spent years watching people make decisions and watching the results of those decisions. That silent observation had given him a skill that most people never noticed. The board meeting was still approaching, and Mark knew time was short. Tom told him that rushing would only lead to mistakes and that the smart thing was to use the remaining time wisely. Tom asked him to call his assistant and request the latest market report. Mark quickly dialed the number, and soon a folder was delivered to the boardroom. Tom thanked the assistant with a small nod, then opened the report and began reading. He traced each line with slow movements as if searching for something hidden in the middle of the numbers. After a moment, Tom closed his eyes as if thinking deeply. When he opened them again, he pointed to a section that showed how recent market instability had affected every company in the region. Tom explained that this instability gave Mark another strong reason to request renegotiation because it proved that the deal collapse was not caused by carelessness but by sudden market changes. Mark felt excitement rising because this meant he could defend the company with confidence. Tom then suggested that he prepare 3 clear points to present to the investors. He told Mark the exact order he should use and explained how to keep the tone firm but respectful. Mark listened carefully, writing every word down. He felt like he was working with a trusted advisor rather than a janitor. Tom reminded him again to breathe slowly and stay collected because the board respected strength but also valued calm thinking. Mark practiced the points he would present, and each time Tom gave him small adjustments to make the message stronger. While they worked together, the hallway outside grew louder because employees were rushing to prepare for the upcoming meeting. Phones rang non-stop and footsteps echoed through the floor. Yet inside the boardroom, everything remained still because Tom's presence created a quiet barrier that blocked the noise from affecting their focus. Then something unexpected happened. One of the senior managers, named Lewis, entered without knocking. He wanted to inform Mark that the investors were restless and wanted answers immediately. Lewis noticed Tom standing beside the table and frowned with confusion. He asked Mark why a janitor was inside the boardroom during a major company emergency. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but Tom gently raised a hand and spoke first. He told Lewis that he was only helping organize the documents. His voice was calm and respectful, but carried a confidence that made Lewis stop speaking for a moment. Lewis shrugged and turned back to Mark, saying that the board members expected him downstairs within minutes. Tom stepped aside to let them talk privately, but before leaving he whispered to Mark to stay focused on truth and clarity. Lewis left the room still puzzled by the sight he had walked into. Mark turned back to Tom with gratitude because even the small interruption had not shaken the quiet balance that Tom maintained. Tom asked Mark one more time to rehearse the points he planned to share with the board. Mark spoke with steady voice now because Tom had helped him understand every detail of the situation. After the final rehearsal, Tom placed a hand on the chair beside him and told Mark that the path forward was clear and that he should walk into the meeting with calm strength. Mark nodded, feeling ready in a way he had not expected to feel earlier. Before stepping out, Mark looked at Tom and asked why he knew so much about business documents. Tom paused with a thoughtful expression, then answered that life had taught him many things long before he became a janitor. He told Mark that understanding people and decisions came from watching carefully and listening with patience. He said that every room in this building held lessons if one chose to pay attention. Mark felt a deep respect for him because he realized that wisdom did not depend on status or job title. Tom had spent years quietly observing how leaders handled success and failure, and he had learned what many experienced managers never understood. Mark thanked him again with sincerity, and Tom responded with a small nod that carried more meaning than any long speech. Then Mark walked toward the door, but before stepping out he turned back and asked Tom if he would stay in the boardroom until he returned. Tom agreed with a warm smile and told him that the room would be ready when he came back. Mark took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway. Staff members stood up as he walked by because they sensed a change. He no longer looked stressed or confused. There was steady confidence in his steps. As he reached the elevator, he glanced back at the boardroom and saw Tom through the glass wall, moving his hands once more, arranging the last sets of documents. The room seemed to fall into a peaceful stillness again, as if Tom carried a quiet strength that filled every corner. Mark stepped into the elevator, feeling ready for the challenge ahead. Downstairs, the board members gathered in a long room filled with serious faces. They were prepared to question him sharply and demand explanations. Mark walked to the front with calm eyes. He placed the documents on the table, raised his head, and spoke with the steady confidence that Tom had helped him build. Every point he presented was clear and strong. Every moment felt controlled. Meanwhile, on the top floor, Tom sat in the quiet boardroom and looked out the window at the city below. His hands rested calmly on the table. He waited because he knew that the real turning point of the day was unfolding downstairs. The boardroom downstairs filled with a heavy silence as Mark finished his opening statement. Every board member watched him closely, waiting to see if he could defend the company from the crisis that had shaken everyone earlier. Mark kept his posture steady and his voice calm because he remembered every word Tom had shared with him upstairs. For the first time since the trouble began, he felt that he was not standing alone. He felt the quiet strength that Tom had left with him before he stepped into the meeting. The board members began asking questions one by one, trying to understand what had gone wrong with the deal. Mark listened carefully and answered each question with clear reasoning and solid explanation. He pointed out the hidden clause that Tom had reminded him of and the sudden market changes that had affected the deal. His explanation made the board members exchange surprised looks because they had not noticed the details that Mark was now presenting with such confidence. As the conversation continued, some members started to relax because they saw that the company still had a path forward. A few of them even nodded with approval. However, one senior member named Harris still looked unsure. Harris was known for being strict and never accepting answers until every detail was tested. He leaned back in his chair and stared at Mark before asking if he could guarantee that the investors would accept renegotiation. Mark paused because he knew he could not make a promise that depended on other people, but he did not want to show any weakness. He took a slow breath and then explained that the renegotiation clause was legally valid and that the market shift provided strong support for their request. He added that the company would present the renegotiation with honesty and professionalism, which usually encouraged investors to respond positively. Harris studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if testing the strength of every word. After a long silence, he finally agreed that the plan was reasonable. The tension in the room eased as the rest of the board accepted the direction that Mark had offered. When the meeting ended, the members approached him one by one to shake his hand. Some of them praised his composure, while others thanked him for protecting the company during such a difficult moment. Mark felt grateful, but he also knew that much of the credit belonged to Tom, who had seen what no one else had seen. When the boardroom was empty, Mark stepped into the hallway and let out a breath he had been holding for too long. His assistant approached him quickly and asked if everything had gone well. Mark nodded and told her that he wanted to return to the top floor. He walked toward the elevator, feeling lighter than he had felt all day. As he rode upward, he thought about the strange calm that had entered the building the moment Tom stepped into the boardroom earlier. It made him wonder how much hidden strength a person could carry behind a quiet and simple appearance. When the elevator doors opened at the top floor, Mark stepped out and saw Tom sitting at the boardroom table just as he had promised. The papers were arranged neatly, and the screens had been turned off, leaving the room in a peaceful dim light. Tom looked up with a warm smile when Mark entered. Mark walked toward him with gratitude filling every step. He told Tom that the meeting went far better than expected and that the board had accepted the plan. Tom nodded as if he already knew what the outcome would be. He said that truth and clarity always helped people see things in a better way, and that calm thinking guided the path forward even in hard times. Mark sat down across from Tom and told him that he had never seen anyone understand documents and patterns the way Tom did. He asked if Tom had studied business in the past. Tom looked thoughtful for a moment, then shared a quiet part of his life. He explained that long before he worked as a janitor, he had spent years helping small businesses in his old neighborhood. He learned how to look at problems from different angles because many people came to him for advice. Over time, he discovered that the hardest part of any problem was the fear it created in people. If fear was removed, then solutions became easier to find. Tom said that he enjoyed cleaning work because it allowed him to stay close to people while watching how they handled challenges. He believed that observation itself was a kind of education. Mark listened with deep respect. He felt humbled because he realized that wisdom did not depend on title or salary. It depended on how a person viewed the world and how much they learned from living it. Tom had seen life from many sides and carried lessons that most leaders never experienced. Mark thanked him again and told him that the company would not have found a solution without his help. Tom smiled and replied that every person had a role in turning a dark moment into a hopeful one. He said that Mark had faced the board with honesty and calm strength, which made the plan work. Just then the door opened, and the assistant entered with a sense of urgency. She informed Mark that the investors wanted a virtual meeting within the hour to discuss the renegotiation. Mark felt his heart jump, but Tom placed a hand on the table and reminded him to stay steady. Tom said that the investors needed to hear the same calm tone that he had shown in the board meeting. Mark nodded, feeling steady again. Before leaving the room, Mark looked at Tom and asked if he could stay on the top floor until the investor meeting ended. Tom agreed and said he would be right there if Mark needed him again. Mark walked out of the room with renewed confidence. As he moved through the hallway, employees watched him with admiration because he no longer looked troubled. Instead, he walked with the strength of someone who had found clarity in the middle of confusion. While Mark prepared for the investor meeting, Tom continued arranging the documents in a way that made the next steps clear. His hands moved with the same quiet skill as before. Outside the large windows, the city lights began to glow as evening approached. Yet the boardroom stayed peaceful because Tom carried a calm presence that softened the noise of the world. He knew that the hardest part of the day was not over yet, but he trusted that Mark was ready to face whatever came next. Downstairs, employees whispered to each other about how the CEO had turned the crisis around. They wondered how he had found the strength after struggling so much earlier in the day. No one imagined that an older janitor with a gentle smile had guided the light back into the building. Tom remained silent about his part because he never did things for praise. He simply wanted to help when help was needed. As the hour approached, Mark stood in his office adjusting his notes. He took a slow breath and whispered the words that Tom had told him earlier. He felt the calm return. Then he stepped into the virtual meeting room, ready to face the investors with steady confidence. The virtual meeting with the investors began with a sense of sharp tension. Their faces appeared on the large screen in front of Mark, and each expression carried worry about the broken deal. Some looked frustrated, while others seemed disappointed because they believed the company had lost its balance. Mark stood firm with his notes in hand, and remembered the calm lines Tom had shared with him earlier. He greeted the investors with a steady tone and thanked them for joining on short notice. His voice did not shake and his eyes remained focused because he knew the company depended on the way he handled this moment. As the investors began speaking, they expressed their concerns one after another. Some questioned why the deal had failed, while others demanded to know why no early warning had been given. Mark listened without interrupting. Every word they spoke any leader would fear, but Mark stayed calm because he understood that fear only made the problem appear bigger. When they finally paused, he stepped forward and began explaining the full situation with simple, clear detail. He showed them the exact market changes that had shaken the deal, and how these changes had affected every company in the same sector. Then he pointed to the secondary clause that Tom had shown him earlier, which allowed renegotiation in times of unexpected instability. The investors leaned closer to their screens as Mark explained each point with clarity. They expected excuses, but instead he offered transparent reasoning and honest acknowledgement of the issues. This shifted their tone. One of the senior investors, named Rowan, asked how the company planned to move forward from this setback. Mark answered by presenting a calm plan built on realistic steps rather than rushed actions. He told them that the renegotiation would not only protect their investment, but also open room for a more stable long-term partnership. As he spoke, he felt the strength that Tom had helped him build rising within him. Slowly, the investors began to relax. Their faces softened and their voices grew calmer. Some nodded in agreement. Rowan asked a final question about whether Mark was confident in leading the company through the new direction. Mark took a slow breath the way Tom had taught him and replied that he believed in honest leadership and steady decision-making. He promised to guide the company with clear vision rather than fear. Something in his tone carried truth, and the investors recognized it because they exchanged thoughtful glances and finally agreed to proceed with renegotiation. When the meeting ended, the screen went dark and Mark stood still for a moment, letting the relief settle into his body. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. The worst part of the crisis had passed. He picked up his notes and walked toward the elevator, and this time his steps felt light. He knew exactly where he wanted to go because someone upstairs had been waiting quietly just to make sure everything turned out well. When Mark entered the top-floor boardroom, he saw Tom sitting in the same calm position as before. The room felt peaceful, as if the earlier chaos had never existed. Tom looked up with a gentle smile and asked if the meeting had gone well. Mark walked forward with gratitude pouring out of him. He told Tom that the investors had agreed to renegotiate and that the company was safe. Tom nodded with quiet satisfaction, as if he had expected this outcome all along. Mark sat down across from Tom and told him that he had never met anyone with the kind of understanding Tom carried. He expressed how grateful he felt that Tom had been in the right place at the right time and that he had guided him through the darkest moment of his leadership. Tom listened with a warm, steady expression. Then he said something that surprised Mark. He explained that everyone in the world had a gift and that the gift only mattered when it was used to help others. He said that Mark had the gift of leading people and giving them direction, and he himself had the gift of observing situations and bringing clarity. Both gifts were different, but both held value. Mark felt humbled. He asked Tom why he stayed in a janitor job when he clearly had the ability to do much more. Tom answered that he had lived many years in places where titles and money controlled everything. He had seen how people forgot kindness when chasing success. Over time, he found more peace in simple work because it allowed him to stay close to people without the noise of competition. He said that he liked being the quiet hand that brought order where confusion lived. He believed that life always placed him where someone needed a moment of clarity. Mark sat silently for a moment, absorbing every word. He realized that Tom had helped him not only save the deal but also understand something deeper about leadership. Tom stood slowly and began gathering his cleaning tools as the evening sun cast warm light across the room. Mark watched him and felt that this simple man had changed the entire direction of his day and perhaps his entire view of leadership. Just then the door opened and several staff members entered with smiles. They told Mark that the news of the renegotiation had already spread through the building and that the team felt relieved. They also mentioned that people were curious about how he had managed to turn the crisis around so quickly. Mark looked at Tom and saw that the older man remained calm and quiet, preparing to leave. For a moment Mark wanted to tell everyone the truth that Tom had been the steady guide behind the scenes, but when he looked into Tom's eyes he understood that Tom did not want recognition. Tom believed that his role was simply to help and then step back. The staff left the room, leaving Mark and Tom alone again. Mark thanked him one more time and Tom nodded with the same simple warmth he had shown all day. He told Mark that the hardest storms often revealed the strongest parts of a person. Then he slowly pushed his cart toward the hallway, ready to continue his quiet work, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Mark followed him to the door and watched him walk down the hall with steady steps. Employees who passed by greeted Tom with casual nods, not knowing that he had played a role more important than anyone could imagine. Mark stood there with a thoughtful expression, realizing that greatness could be hidden in the most unexpected places. That night when Mark finally left the building, he felt a deeper sense of understanding. He walked out into the cool air knowing that he had seen the truth that leadership was not about standing above others but about learning from anyone who brought wisdom. In his mind, he repeated the moment when he had said, "Please make it fast," and Tom's hands had moved with calm strength, turning fear into silence and silence into clarity. The company stood safe, the future open again, and the memory of Tom's quiet guidance stayed with Mark as a lesson he would never forget. The tall tower behind him shimmered under the night sky, and for the first time in many weeks he walked home with peaceful steps, knowing that the day he almost lost everything became the day he learned the true meaning of wisdom.